was the biggest project I've probably done in a long, long time. I altered my daughter-in-law's wedding dress. Yes, my daughter-in-law's wedding dress. It was a beautiful dress. It just didn't fit. Way too big. So, here we go. Here she is, picking it up from the bridal salon, and it looks like it fits good, but that's because you can't see how much the lady in the back is holding. So then we take it home and we put it on and we start putting pins in it to see what needs to be changed. We're going to take a whole bunch out of this side. We're going to take some out of the back there, a little bit on either side. It's just pinned on one side. We're going to take some out of the far side. Look, even out of the waist and out of the front. Remember in the picture, it kind of squares off at the bottom. We're going to make it pointed and take some of that out. We're going to take some out of the sleeve so it doesn't dangle so low on our arm. First thing I did was to measure everything that I had pinned so that once I took the pins out, I could remember how much I needed to take out of all of these different seams. And let me tell you, some of them, it was a lot. But the seam ripper became my best friend. I started by taking the skirt off. That is a huge thing to do on this dress that's so important to someone. And I did not video the whole thing, and you can thank me because it took me about 2.5 hours just to take the skirt off. A lot of this is netting, and it's very pretty, but it was netting sewed with invisible thread, which is basically like fishing line. I couldn't see it sometimes. I was just sort of having to know what a seam does and where it should be to pick it out because I couldn't destroy the fabric until it was all done. I had to keep all the fabric so I could know where I was taking things out. So anyway, I spent a lot of time at first with the seam ripper. But then look, watch. No! Yes. That is so scary. Back to the seam ripper. Take the side seams apart. So you can see how big it is there, that side panel. And look, this is how much I'm going to take off. Do you see that? That is so much. There, that's cutting it. Taking it apart, cutting it. If you have to go backwards, it feels like to go forward. So then pin that in. And I have to tell you, I tried to use the invisible thread on my machine. I did not like it. My machine did not like it. So I just used white and it looked fine. You couldn't see it. So pin that and sew that and then fold the seam allowance in and put the lining back on top of it. And I have to say, I wore my readers a lot on this project because I couldn't always see what it was I needed to do. But I wanted that all to lay smooth there in the front and not the seam allowance go in. I wanted it to stay underneath there. So sewing that back on both sides. Now, later I'm going to find out that there's a real treat about that because that little spaghetti strap up there, yeah, it's twisted on both sides. So later on I'm going to have to take that strap out because I'm not going to take that seam out once I've redone it. All right, same thing on the other side. Cut off a whole bunch. Really, I took out about 4 inches. Pin it back down and then top stitch it. It didn't show through in a way that anyone else could see it, so it was fine that it was top stitch, real close to the edge. And I did do a little zigzag at the bottom to help keep that bottom edge close together. And checked it. Yes, those are the same. All right, now on to the middle. And there it is, the seam ripper. I really spent a lot of time with the seam ripper. Here's how big it was when I took that out, that mesh part in the middle, and then I cut it down a good bit there in the center. But also I made it so that it was going to be a point, like I said, at the bottom instead of being squared off at the waistline. So sew that in the same as with the side seams. Sew it in, pin the seam allowance open, pin the lining back on it, and sew that back in place. So then, of course, I have to do the other side and make sure it all lays smooth and that the top edge of that sheer net in the middle was even on both sides so that it wasn't like some kind of wonky job. We don't want wonky. So pinned it again because I pinned it with the seam allowance and then I went back and pinned that lining into place. And then I'm going to top stitch on it. And like I said, invisible thread, it's just no fun. So I went with the white thread here too. And it's very close to the edge so you can't see it. So sew up that, reaching underneath to pull out pins. So it took longer than just zip sewing because I had to get the pins from underneath. And then I have to do the same thing to the other side of the front. Pin the seam allowance open, pin the lining down, and then sew across that space. And then I did a little zigzag at the bottom. You can see in some of the clips where the lace is hanging off of the bottom edge of the bodice. The pieces were longer than the bodice, and I guess they were put on after the garment was finished. So I tried to cut them as little as possible and take them off till they got to a really skinny part and cut it there instead of just cutting the whole thing. Or if it was a flower or a leaf that I could just cut off, take off, then I would do that. All right, and now the sleeves. The sleeves hung too low on her arm. She didn't like that. But they were 2 layers. They were the top tulle that has all the sequins on it and then the bottom layer. So I sewed those together before I cut them because they're kind of hard to see. So I sewed them together and then cut them and cut off about, almost 1.5 inches or so on each of those sleeves. And then just folded these over and pinned them back along that seam and top stitched them into place. When I looked at how they were constructed before I took it apart, that was pretty much what it was done. So I was more than happy to do that the same way. But soon I'm going to pick it up and I'm going to look at it and I'm going to be like, yay, it's almost done. It's looking good. And realize that those spaghetti straps, yeah, I twisted them. They're not straight across. They twist in the middle. But I don't want to take the side off again, so I'm going to have to do something else. Here I spent a minute getting rid of all of the little sequins that were poking through in that seam allowance, because a wedding dress is a beautiful thing to wear, but not if it hurts you, not if it's scratching you, not if it's poking you all day because there's a sequin that's cut in half that's scratching you on the back. So I did that on both sides, went through and got rid of all of the sequins that were sticking through that seam allowance so they didn't hurt her. But there it is. See? Can you believe it? So instead of taking the whole side seam apart, I'm just going to take it out there at the top. And it was hard to do because it was more of that invisible thread, and I just had to keep working it until I could find all of the thread so that it would let go of that tiny little strap. There, got it loose. All right, neaten that up. And then I couldn't figure out how to get it to stick back down in there. I tried the seam ripper, and then I would try my chopstick. And it would go a little bit, and then it would pull it back out. And so then I'd pick up the other tool. So as you can see, it was a weird thing to be a challenge, just to stick that back down in the little hole compared to all of the things that I did. Anyway, I finally got that to go, and then I was just able to sew that on the machine. And I did sew back and forth a few times so that it would be sturdy. We wouldn't want that to be awkward or to come out or to do anything the day of the wedding. So I sewed across there a few times. Oh, but look, in the meantime, I broke a needle. So changing the needle didn't take long. I loved this Brother machine, but still had to change the needle. So finished sewing across that space and then down a little bit to make sure it's secure. Good job. Now these sequins, I noticed, the way they were sewn, some of them would flip one way and some would flip the other, and it would make them look like they weren't even. So I got some thread and went through and sewed them again the opposite direction from the way they had been sewn at the manufacturer, so that they would stay all laying down the same way and not have any overlapping and leaving big gaps. I don't know if it was necessary, but it made me feel better. All right, so there it is. Now the bodice is back together. And look, it fits her so well. Yay! Look, the sleeve, even that's good. But she didn't like the fact that you could kind of see the little bra thing through it and wanted to see if we could put a lining in it. The back was easy because it was flat. It was just 2 sort of triangle shapes in doing it. But the front, it's a princess front, and I don't have the original pattern and didn't want to take it apart. So I pinned some fabric on there and then sewed it together so that I would have something to use as a pattern to use for the regular pieces. I did put this in there to see if this would be thick enough, but it really still didn't cover up those little bra pad things in there. You could still see them too much, so we didn't really like that. So after I fished that up in there, it was a good practice so that the next time when it was the actual one, I had at least practiced on how to get it all the way up on in there. But it just didn't change it enough. You could still see them too much. So I did use those pieces as a pattern, though, to make the finished product. And this is actually a cotton fabric, which seems a little bit strange, but I used 2 pieces so that it would make it completely covered, and where you couldn't see the bra part through it anymore. So that's the side front and the center front piece. Well, there's 2 center fronts because of the way it's split down the middle. Pin that on there, and sew that seam, and then I'm going to sew all the way around to hold all of those together so that they don't slide around when I'm trying to get them inside in between. Now the bad part is this would have been a lot easier at a different timing of it than it was to do here, because I didn't want to take it apart again. It's delicate enough that you lose a little when you take it apart, so I didn't want to take it apart again. So I worked really hard to get it all the way into the edges so that it wouldn't look like it had been an afterthought, because it was an afterthought. And then when I finally got it where I wanted it, I used a lot of pins to hold it along the front, because that was the most important, that it be smooth across the front. So once I finally got all of that pinned in and pinned in the back, then I sewed it by hand. I didn't want to add one more stitch, so I sewed that around by hand. It did take longer to sew it by hand than if I had done it on the machine. It's just though what it has to be. I just felt like it was going to look better because it wasn't quite as tight into the seam as the first seam was. So I didn't want to add another seam where it was like a double top stitch or something. That would be horrible. Anyway, what you're seeing though is all sped up, and because this sewing around just that one front was probably 30 minutes, and there was 4 pieces. So the whole thing that takes about 20 minutes to watch now was really about 25 hours. But look at it. Look how good it looks on her now. Now you can't see the little bra part showing through. It fits her. Time for the skirt. So the skirt needed to be 6 inches shorter, but just in the front. And it had 3-inch horsehair braid on 2 of the 5 layers. So seam ripper time again. So I took off the horsehair braid on the 2 layers that it was on, and then I had to mark them across the front where they needed to be cut so that they were 6 inches shorter, and then taper it to the back so we could keep the length of the train. To sew it back in, I started with the bottom with like right sides together for the horsehair braid. This is the full lining, not the skinny inner lining. There was a skinny inner lining, there's a full size lining, there's 2 layers of tulle, and then there's the tulle that has the sequins on it. So I started with this inner level that needed the horsehair braid sewn back on it. I sewed across the bottom because that was going to be the longest part of that arc. It's a little bit rounded, and then flipped it back up and sewed the top. But now it was too long, so I didn't cut that until I'd gotten to where I didn't have a choice, because I just didn't know how much I needed to cut off. But it needed to be cut off because it was too much because of the change. It was a math thing, and I didn't figure it out in advance. I just cut it when I got to it. But sewed that all the way around the front. Remember, it's still attached in the back. I didn't take it off in the back because I was leaving the length of the train. So I sewed that in there, and that's one layer, one of the harder layers. So then I went ahead and did the next layer that was a little bit harder, and that was the one that showed the most. But same thing, sewed across the bottom edge to get that horsehair braid attached back to it with right sides together, and then flipped it up and sewed it across the top edge of the horsehair braid. Here again, didn't cut it until I had sewn most of the way and just had a little gap left. The tulle layers were easy. I just cut them. And then the innermost lining layer, I just did a serger edge around the bottom. So I was able to double time while I was doing that. While I sewed it on the serger, I had my older machine. This is a Baby Lacasante, which is very old, but I love that machine. It's been a lot of fun for me, but I had it going with a patch. And so this is an old blue thing, old, new, and blue, because it's a new patch made with old fabric. That fabric is actually the leftover fabric from when I made my own wedding dress. And then it has the big M in it that's blue. Not that she couldn't have other things, but this covered some of that fun superstition, I don't know, tradition, we'll call it tradition, that we have now for weddings. So 2 things at the same time. I also made a long chain of serger thread and used it to attach all the layers back together, so that when she picked up the front, she didn't have to make sure she had grabbed all 5 layers. They were attached and they would pull each other up. Look, there's the finished patch. I'll show it to you inside when we get done. Now, before I can put the skirt and the bodice back together, I have to take out a few inches out of the skirt and all the layers. They were all able to be done on the serger though. So each side had about, I don't know, 1.5 inches taken out of it at her waist. So a total of about 3 inches at her waist that I took out. But I had to do both sides on 5 layers. So just taking out that little bit took a hot minute to get them all done. But then once I had all of those layers cut apart, no, not cut apart, put back together. I don't know. Sometimes it's hard to keep up with which direction you're going. You take it apart, you put it together, and then you take something else apart. Anyway, once I had all the layers taken in on the side, I sewed around them to keep them all connected so that when I attached the bodice and the skirt back together, everything stayed in the right place. So now it's time to finally put the bodice and the skirt back together. Yay! I do have to tell you, when I had my daughter-in-law come and try on just the bodice, I did warn her, this is going to be how it is. It's just going to be the top. The skirt's not attached, because I didn't want to totally freak her out that her wedding dress was in 2 pieces. Anyway, she was calm. She trusted me, and everything came out good in the end. Thank goodness. So anyway, now pinning the 4 of the 5 layers of the skirt to the bodice so that I can sew them. That innermost lining is going to cover up all of that seam allowance, so it doesn't get sewn the first time around. So I had to sew around once to get the bodice and 4 out of the 5 layers of the skirt attached, and then take it off and flip it a different way, how it's inside out, so that I could attach that skirt lining back so that it hid all of the seam allowance between the bodice and the skirt, so that it's all nice and smooth and finished looking. Now I gotta say, I was proud of myself right here that I remembered to put those things back in there. They seem like they're just in the way, but they are very important for when you're moving your dress when it's not on you, because they help support the weight of it. If you put that whole dress on a hanger by just those little spaghetti straps, it might not go well. They're attached at the waist, and that way they help support the weight of the dress when it's on the hanger, so that it's not all hanging by those little bitty spaghetti straps. So once I had those back in there, I was able to put that innermost lining back on there that covers up the seam allowance. So this is, though, the last step for the wedding dress on the sewing machine. Once I've done with this step, the last little bit that has to be done is all done by hand. I needed to reattach the lace. See how it's dangling there at the waistline? There were several places all the way around, 4 places where the lace went up and down, and they all needed to be reattached. I made a loop on the back and put a button on the back so that she could bustle it up, and that worked out really well. But in the meantime, I went ahead and made her a veil. She wanted just a really simple veil, so for very little money, we were able to get what we needed. So I cut the bottom so that it was rounded. She wanted it really long. Cut it so it was rounded, and then went back and cut it again so that it was smooth, because the first time I cut it, all of that white tulle on top of that white table, some places were a little jagged, so I smoothed that out. So then I was able to make a long basting stitch across the top edge there, pull out both ends, the bobbin and the top thread, and make a long basting stitch all the way across the top, and pull that down as tight as I could, tie it on one end, pull it up tight on the other, and tie it, and then put it on the comb. The problem is, she wanted it skinnier. So I took it off of the comb, pulled it tighter, cut the comb, sanded the edges of the comb so that it didn't have sharp corners, and sewed it back on, and ended up with a veil that was the size that she had pictured in her mind. It's fine. She was happy. I was happy. There was one last part that I didn't video, and that's that when she put on the finished dress, she felt like the bodice part was a little bit too bright white and wanted to know if we could change the color on it. So I poured coffee on it. Yes, I poured coffee on my daughter-in-law's wedding dress that I had just spent a whole week altering. But because I had lined it with cotton and everything else was a synthetic, it stained the cotton and not everything else. I poured it on there and rinsed it off pretty quick. It was very scary, but she was very pleased with the slight color change, and she looked beautiful, and the dress fit beautifully, so we were all very happy for the outcome. There it is, ready to be put on by the bride the day of the wedding. And look, there's the patch inside, old, new, and blue all together. Ta-da! I'm glad that's done. I'm glad she trusted me. I'm glad I was able to make it for her. But I'm glad it's done. It was quite an adventure to alter my daughter-in-law's wedding dress. But yay! She looked fantastic. Remember, he who finds a wife finds what is good and obtains favor from the Lord. See you next time.